Now, compared to the assessment plan, like I mentioned earlier, the assessment reports are done every year. And here's the components you want to see in a typical assessment plan. I'm sorry, yes, a typical assessment report. It outlines the SOLs, or student learning outcomes, that were assessed for that year. It describes the specific assessment methods and tools that were used to gather evidence for the outcomes. And ideally, when someone uses a rubric or a test or something like that, they provide a copy of the tool that's being used. They identify the specific sources of the evidence and briefly talk about the results of the method and the extent to which SOLs were achieved. And using figures and tables are great, really sort of lay out to reviewers what was accomplished. Having some sort of summary or some conclusions about the assessment results, identify how the results were shared and with whom. So the previous example, when we looked at those plans, it talked about who's overseeing this process and who it's being shared with. And then identify how the assessment data was used to make some decisions about changes to the programs and actions taken based on that. Now, here's the template for the assessment report. And unlike the assessment plan, remember that's a graphic organizer, it organizes everything into a table. The assessment report has more of a narrative format. And the reason why this is we want to give people enough space to talk about what they did, really unpack what the assessment process was like, what was learned, and what was done with that information. There's a section on here about program improvements made or actions planned in response to these assessment findings. Now, this is something you want to make sure you respond to, because remember that assessment cycle we looked at earlier, where we looked at student learning outcomes, then evidence and improvement. This is how you address that improvement component of that assessment cycle. As I mentioned, this form is set up to allow a lot of details. In the previous versions of this, try to use a table similar to the plan, but what we found was a lot of people weren't able to tell the complete story of what they did. They tended to truncate what they were doing with their assessment reporting. So this gives an opportunity for departments to really unpack what they did and give details about the impact that they were having on student learning. Another component of the report I really want to highlight is there's a section called follow-ups on prior year student learning outcomes assessment reports, results rather. There's two components. Item one, this section here, that's labeled item one. This is addressing how previous years' improvements have made an impact, while item two is about what's continuing to take place, but ongoing efforts are still being implemented. And maybe you haven't seen the results of them yet, but this is something you're still continuing to work with.